Okay, good afternoon everyone. I'll just start with some introductory remarks to this, some preliminaries to today's workshop. First of all, thank you very much for coming to all of you. It's a nice sunny summer day, so I know to be inside it's already a little bit of sacrifice. I am especially grateful for my guests who came from various places around Europe to be here with us and to make this workshop actually possible. I will introduce them in a second, but before I do so, I'd like to say something about the workshop itself, how it's going to be organized, how we plan to proceed. But initially, I'd like to put it into a broader context in which this workshop is taking place. This workshop is to a certain extent envisaged as a final leg of my postdoc project, which concerns the question of postmodern challenges of transnational law for the European Union. In that project, I'm addressing many topical issues and challenges. I'm thinking about modernity and the shift to postmodernity. I'm reflecting on using legal pluralism as a paradigm, as a best fit paradigm through which we can approach the legal questions and the legal issues and challenges spurred by transnational law in the European Union. And of course, to do so, one has to have a conception, understanding of transnational law as well as of the European Union. So much of that I'm doing in my project has of course been influenced by my work before, by my work at NYU School of Law and the EUI, the European University Institute, and other international academic sites where I worked and studied. And it was there where I got in touch with the work, ideas, theories, thought-provoking challenges by today's distinguished guests. It has been their work that has inspired me a lot, that has posed a lot of challenges to me, a lot of interesting questions that I try to find answers to, and therefore it's my really great honor to have these intellectual giants here with me today and indeed with us to question them, to grill them, to see what's really going on in the field of transnational and global. So, as my project is very large, initially I should have said it's of course funded and supported and sponsored, and I'm grateful for that to the Slovenian research agency who's been really generous in supporting me in this project for these 2 years, and also for the support for the funds of today's meeting. So as the project is very large, today what we are going to be focusing on is a little bit narrower topic, though not that narrower. We are going to ask questions about the concept and conceptions of transnational and global law. And luckily enough, it's not going to be me who will be answering this question, but I will just be asking questions, and it will be them who try to answer. So about the distinguished guests, let me try to introduce them to you, to those of you who maybe are not familiar with their work or haven't come across their work. And I'll start from my side with Neil Walker. So Neil Walker holds the Regius Chair of Public Law and the Law of Nature and Nations at the University of Edinburgh. His main area of expertise is constitutional theory. He has published extensively on the constitutional dimension of legal order at the sub-state, state, supranational and international level. He has also published at length on the relationship between security, legal order and political community. He maintains a more general interest in broader questions of legal theory, as well as in various substantive dimensions of UK and EU public law. He really is an international, maybe we call it a global scholar, a jurist, maybe he would call himself like that, who has taught at various places, starting at Edinburgh. Then he was a professor of legal and constitutional theory at the University of Aberdeen, and most recently was professor of European law at the European University Institute in Florence, where he was also the first dean of studies, and last but not least, most importantly, he was also my supervisor. He's also held various visiting appointments in many places: Tilburg, University of Columbia, University of Cornell, Toronto, New York University, and most recently, something I'm aware of, is the Yale Law School. Next to him is Matthias Kuhn. Matthias Kuhn is Inge Professor of Law at the New York University School of Law, as well as he's also holding a research professorship on globalization and the rule of law at the Social Science Research Center in Berlin. He's also there at the Humboldt University. He also has taught and lectured in leading universities worldwide and was a visiting professor and John Harvey Regular Lecturer on World Organization at Harvard Law School. He holds a JSD from Harvard and has pursued studies in law, philosophy, and political science at Christian Albrecht University of Kiel. He was in Paris at Sorbonne and Harvard University. He's on the editorial board of several journals. He's also done a lot of work in the field of global, European, and comparative public law. And his work emphasizes the analytical and normative connection between law, claims to legitimate authority, and public reason and institutional conditions under which such claims can be made plausible. He argues for the need to reconceive the liberal democratic constitutional tradition in cosmopolitan and pluralist terms, but we will hear more of that today. Next to him is Gianluigi Palombella. He's a professor of legal philosophy at the Law Faculty of Parma. He holds a degree in law from the University of Pisa and a PhD from Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa. He's also visited a number of places and taught and lectured there, among others, Yale Law School, Northwestern University, UNSW, Edinburgh Law School. He was a senior Rodel Fellow at the EUI and an invited inaugural Fellow at the Strauss Institute at New York University. He has held diverse academic research responsibilities in the last decades and lectured widely in several countries. He has published extensively in the fields of legal philosophy, legal theory, as such and applied, in public, private, and international law, sociology of law, history of legal concepts, and institutions, constitutionalism, and political theory. Finally, Jose Manuel Barreto. He studied law at the Externado University of Colombia, Bogota, and holds a BA in philosophy from the National University of Colombia, Bogota too. He also has an MA in human rights from the ICS University of London. He received his PhD in law for the Colonial Turn and Sympathy, a critique of the Eurocentric and rationalist theory of human rights at Birkbeck College, University of London. He has worked as a law researcher for the Colombian Commission of Jurists. He also worked at the University of Andes, was a visiting researcher at the Department of Political Science before becoming a researcher at the Center for Social Legal Research in 1999. Now he is in Germany. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the program Rechtskulturen at the Forum Transregionale Studien at Humboldt University in Berlin. And since October 2014, he is a fellow at the Käthe Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture. His work is focused on human rights, international law, their critique from a third world perspective, and from emotional approach to human rights. He's one of the most prolific and creative voices, chiefly concerned with the critique of the present hegemonic transnational or global law. So, I mean, it goes without saying that we have a group of excellent academics, excellent scholars, so it would be more than appropriate to just hand the floor to them. But before to do so, just another short organizational remark. This workshop will be broken down in two parts. In the first part, which will last till, let's say, 6 o'clock, we're going to discuss the conceptual, perhaps also methodological questions. Then we have a short coffee break, and after that, we move to the normative dimension, the normative and as-applied challenges spurred by the transnational and global law. And at the end of the workshop, there will also be, and I assume you're here for that, there will be also an opportunity to pose questions about the subject matter. So, having said all that, and I already spoken too much, I should shut up, we should get started. And the first question, the first challenge that I'd like to put on the table is about the very subject matter of the day. So we are talking about the concept and conceptions of transnational and global. Naturally, the first question which needs to be posed is the following. What is, in the first place, global and transnational law? And secondly, why is it important to talk about global and transnational law today? If it is important in the first place. I intend to put this question to Neil, also for a simple reason that he recently published this book, The Intimations of Global Law. So Neil, maybe you can start with that, in answering these very simple, two simple questions.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So it'll take me about 3.5 hours to read the entirety of this book, so you can sit back and relax. Okay, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the introduction, and it's great to be here. I was here once before, a number of years ago, and very much enjoyed it. Before I met, I think. So it's great to be back, especially on such an interesting group. So, let me start by saying that maybe with something which may seem fairly obvious, but the reason why there's such emphasis upon concepts such as transnational law and global law, and in due course we can look at a distinction between these two terms, is that there seems to be an awareness, an intuition, a sense, certainly within the academic community, that actually there has been a decentering of state law. State law is no longer viewed as being at the centre of the legal universe in the way that once it was. So let me say something about this and how we might characterise this. Right? Obviously, this is very, very stylised history which we're doing here. It's no part of my argument that one day we lived in a state-based system, then the next day it was transformed into something else. The state-based system was always a partial system. It was also an imperial system. It was a system that was organised around Western states with their colonies and their empires beyond this. It was never a system which was undifferentiated. You had other sorts of empires and other sorts of political structures at the same time. The state-based system was never hegemonic. But what it was a framework for thinking about law, which was very, very powerful. And it was a framework which was based upon the idea of the centrality of state sovereignty, both internally and externally. And I think maybe one way to describe it, and one of the ways that I tried to describe it in the book, is to say it was based upon what I call a triple divide, right? 3 sets of divisions. So one division is a straightforward one between what you might call the internal and the external. The idea that internal sovereignty and external sovereignty inhabit quite different domains of law. There's something called domestic constitutional law, and there's something called international law. And through internal sovereignty, we have domestic law, including constitutional law. Through external sovereignty, each of these sovereigns has a voice and a title to participate in international relations. A straightforward distinction. A second distinction in the triple divide is what I call the internal distinction, which is to say that for each of these states and each of their internal orders, they are mutually exclusive. They are hermetically sealed off. The domestic law of country A is sealed off from the domestic law of country B. Okay? So the internal distinction is also important. But also there's a third distinction, which I call the external distinction, which is to say that there's a further frontier in international relations, which says that the only key actors themselves are states. Okay? So think of it in terms of a kind of box matrix. Look at these windows at the back of this room. So what you actually have is a series of boxes where there's a distinction between the internal and the external, between the different internals, and then around the whole thing there's this idea that it's a state-based order, and the other actors and other legal actors do not have the status of states within transnational legal relations. So if that's the starting point, then of course there always were examples of international law, of private international law, of different forms of transnational law, jus commune, etc., etc. But what we're seeing in the context of the present wave of globalization is a massive intensification of the movement which breaks down these 3 sets of divisions. Okay? Which, whether it be through the creation of supranational organizations such as the EU, or international organizations such as the World Trade Organization and the United Nations, or whether it be inwards within the state, pressures within the state from sub-state federal units and other quasi-politics within the state, or whether it be from the private world, whether it be anything from the FIFA, a good example for these days, or the International Olympic Committee, or ICANN, which deals with the regulation of the internet, which is actually a hybrid public-private body, or the International Standards Organization, which specifies the details of just every piece of furniture in this room. What you're talking about is a vast movement of regulation of a sort which defines the model, the box matrix model with the three divisions and the three divides here. Now, I'm going to stop there because beyond that, that's simply making the negative point. Beyond that, there's all sorts of questions about why this has happened, what the normative implications of it are, and also, I think quite crucial to the debate also, how do we subcategorize, say, transnational law from global law, etc., etc. But I'll leave these questions on the table at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. Matthias, maybe you could jump in here and add something to this, maybe to the question why this has happened, and also maybe say something, how would you distinguish transnational law from local law? And what I would already like to, the ball I would like to throw in the air is also whether, how do we know that transnational law or global law is really law?
That's a lot of questions.
To get the ball rolling.
But if you ask three really hard questions, right, I'll do a great job to answer 1.5 of them.
Okay.
So I'll try to do that. To begin with, to complement what Neil said, and to answer your question as to at least what may to some extent account for this development. Why did it occur? Then it has as much to do, I believe, with actual changes in social practices. So new institutions being created, new legal norms being generated. That's the part of the story. The other part of the story is that there is also a different normative understanding. Our cognitive frame, or at least the cognitive frame of many relevant actors, has changed. And this happens in the context of the end of the Cold War. So this is now the moment, let's call it a little bit polemical, the Fukuyama moment. So the moment post-1990 when there is an understanding that somehow the world is no longer best understood as being constituted by a number of major powers with their own legal system, competing with one another somehow, economically, militarily, politically, internationally. But somehow there is a confidence that ultimately those wars, the Cold War, the competition, this deep competition between systems is over. And what is left is the idea that there is a world of states, of equally sovereign states, that have a certain internal structure, and that internal structure has to meet certain constitutional requirements, which in abstract form would have to be fleshed out in terms of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So post-1990, all the new countries that were established, all the constitutions that were given, were basically attempts to contextualize in an appropriate way the idea of liberal constitutional democracy. So there was something like, not a universal, but a dominant, you might say, a hegemonic consensus, that this would be the way to go. So this was a dominant normative view. And connected with it was a normative view that these states that have a certain internal structure should be integrated into a world community, which itself would have to meet certain rule of law requirements. So these states would be embedded in an international and a global legal order. And what makes it global rather than just international is not just that somehow institutions are strengthened to discipline states more effectively, but also that there is the organization of a global economy where other actors, private actors, and other institutions would play a central role that would not easily be characterized as state institutions in any meaningful way. So I think these are two basic ideas we have about how the world works and how states fit into the world. I think they have changed post-1990. And they informed a very different way for thinking about law in that world. Just to illustrate one point before I stop. If Slovenia decided today that it wanted a new constitution, it's not happy with its old constitution, it wants a new constitution, then in the traditional world, of state constitutional law, what we would now look at is, well, what does the Constitution say about having a new constitution? What procedures does it establish? And maybe we have some constitutional theory that says, well, it doesn't really matter because if we give ourselves a new constitution, then we, the people, as constituent power, can just decide as it wants to establish a new constitution. And then the question is only how to set up the process. And then everything is up for grabs. In the new world, post-1990, it is simply not the case that all is up for grabs. The starting point is, at the beginning of deliberations is, certainly if you're in the European Union, but also if you're not, that whatever constitution will be the result of this process, it will again have to be an attempt to work out and interpret what it means in our political community, to appropriately establish a commitment to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Now, as I said, there's lots that's going to be contested, and there's lots of space, of discretion for the political process to work out the details. But if there was a country that says, this human rights, democracy, rule of law stuff, we don't believe in that, we're going to do something radically different, then that would arguably be, certainly in the EU, you'd get into trouble because it would violate Article 6, paragraph 2 of the EUT. And under international law, it would probably violate provisions of human rights law. And more generally, there'd be a serious backlash against such an attempt. So, with other words, what you have is even within the structure of the domestic state, so even when it comes to it, when we just focus on the traditional state, because it still exists, it's still quite powerful, but the internal structure, the basic normative criteria governing its internal constitution have basically been globalized. So globalization is not just about what goes on beyond the state, it goes right into the internal, the demands made on the internal structure of each equal sovereign state.
Okay, having said that, so having explained sort of the emergence of transnational and global law through you're saying the practice has changed, but also the cognitive framework has changed, or has been changing. In some places, it's still unchanged. Let me nevertheless, before I move this on and ask the questions, what makes global and transnational law properly law, and what kind of cognitive framework are we actually working with when we are approaching this phenomenon? Let me allow me to go once more back to you and just ask you, for our audience and for those who are interested, what are actually the distinctions between these words, these denominations, between global law, transnational law? Matthias has also said international law. Just for somebody who's just approaching this field, without knowing anything about it, how would we explain to this kind of person what's actually global law, transnational law, international? What is the relation? What's the distinction between these phenomena?
You want me to quickly?
Very quickly, just to get the discussion.
Okay. Well, I mean, right. The problem is, okay, you've used some of the terms. That's not all of the terms. So let's just stick with these three terms at the moment because that's useful. And each one of these terms is contested. Right. So international law is the older term. Right. International law comes from what I call the box matrix world. It's the opposite of state law. Right. Now, international lawyers, they tend to think that anything which isn't state law is international law. So they would happily colonize intellectually, many other areas of transnational law, etc., etc. But international law is normally understood as the law between states, both the transactional law between states, but also things like jus cogens and general principles of international law, the more basic structure of general rules which are not based upon contract or transaction. But the key idea there is international, so states are the key actors there. Transnational law is a term which was actually coined by Philip Jessup in 1958, I think it was. And it's a very, very, 56, it's a very, very broad term. I don't think I have the definition there, but basically it covers any type of law where, as a matter of jurisdiction, source, effect, etc., there is a transnational element. So it's basically any law which is capable of crossing a national border. So that's supposed to be a capacious term, right? And he coined that term because he actually thought that the notion of international law was becoming insufficient for a world which was already globalizing in ways, which was breaking the boundaries of international law. The term global law is more recent, more contentious. I use it in a particular way, but let me just say two ways in which it's used, right? One way in which it's used is well, three ways. One way in which it's used is a kind of alternative to transnational law, right? And there you have to bear in mind that there's a lot of rhetorical usage of the idea of global law. Global commercial firms will often talk about global law, etc., in ways which are conceptually extremely loose, but rhetorically harsh. A second way in which it's used is actually a very thin way, where you're only dealing with global institutions. So what the UN does, what it generates, would be called global law from that perspective. And a few other worldwide, what you might call planetary institutions, would be seen as a part of global law. I use it in a somewhat different way. I use it to describe any form of law where, regardless of its source or pedigree, that its remit, the area that it affects, its jurisdiction, is in theory unlimited. It's not limited territorially, it's not limited to a particular citizenry, it's only limited in the way that law has to be logically limited, i.e. in terms of its material structure. So, for example, we might think again about the general principles of international law. We might think about the emergent principles of so-called global administrative law as ideas which are seen as somehow operating in the legal world, but they operate in a way which does not depend on a particular pedigree or a particular state authority, and which has no limitation other than the limitation which is actually imposed by the material structure of the rule itself. Now, there's much more to be said about the idea of global law than that, but one of the things that interests me is the extent to which, through a whole set of convergent trends, through a revival of notions of jus gentium and the jus commune, through ideas of global administrative law, global constitutional law, etc., there's a number of different ways of thinking about it. Sometimes it's much more conceptual than positive. And again, there's an interesting set of questions there about the extent to which something is simply proto-law or law in the coming as opposed to something which is actually an effective legal law. But there's a massive convergence of different ways of thinking about law through this kind of global imaginary, which I would call global law, and which stands alongside and part of, a distinctive part of, the broader set of transnational legal rules.
Okay.
Yes?
I would like to add something.
Sure, please.
My intention here is like to try, on the basis of the to develop that concept of global law, and to pinpoint in particular things that for me are very interesting. Mainly on the basis of what you said at the very beginning. You identify global law as a moment in law in which state law is descending, which for me has to do, probably also think in that direction, that the state is not anymore the only one legislating or creating the law. The state is not anymore the only source of law. So the question that appears there is who else is giving the law? Who else is creating it? And for me that is very interesting and is the contribution of global law and has to do with the appearance or the realization that there are other sources of law like the companies, transnational companies, and the international financial institutions. I'm thinking of the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. And that is very important. It has to do with that question of why it's important to speak about global law. Because realizing that these other sources of law are operating, law is able to intervene in a zone of legal life that in some way was put aside. I mentioned these material and historical sources of this. I am thinking of the phenomenon that has already been mentioned and has to do with the social and historical changes in contemporary world that are described as globalization. Globalization understood in a more social, material, historical way as sources or as constituting materially the law we are involved now. And beyond globalization, what is behind globalization? And what if we think globalization in connection with economy and with the history of capitalism and accumulation of capital and global capitalism? What has to do globalization and global law with capitalism?
Everything.
So why don't you say it?
But if
Just without asking.
Well, it's everything, but it's something that we lawyers do not deal with usually.
And is that true? Is that true? That's kind of received wisdom that lawyers don't deal with that. I think about these things all the time. Many of my colleagues think about these things all the time.
But is there a theory of capital accumulation in your understanding of global law? Is there an understanding of the history of capitalism as the motor, as the engine drawing, advancing globalization?
It's certainly discussed. But at the end of the day, I don't have to agree that is, at the end of the day, there are many, many theories of the understanding of globalization. And most of them give a significant right of place to the development of capitalism and to economic relations. But, it's not the only thing that they talk about. It's talking about other dimensions as well. So, anyone who thought about this and didn't give economic factors a significant part would be crazy. They'd be missing things in that. I agree. But I don't think other than a few complacent triumphalists, who think that the globalization of certain economic models, in the Washington Consensus, etc., is an unqualifiedly good thing. I don't think there's many people out there who aren't at least aware of the sort of questions you're talking about. And I think most lawyers today, or most academic lawyers, have a decent awareness of these issues.
May I answer the question that you also asked something? So you can start. Thank you. No, just coming back to the hardware-software point. Well, I started from software just in order to say that there is no system. And since it is not the stage in which we can say what we really think, but we have to construct the framework. So I simply stopped from going ahead. But the simple point for me is that we do not have a system in terms of globality of law. And we are fortunate because of this. All that in terms of regulatory capacity and legality and normativity has been constructed beyond the state was not intended to be comprehensive and coherent or complete or organic. So we should recognize this with many other things, but there is no hardware. We have the software that goes, this is the point, without error. Now, the conclusion for now, for me, is that instead of running after, going in search of the great old man that is behind everything in the global setting, it is better that we try to assess coherence and justice on a retail base, on a case-by-case basis, because the true point that has been already stressed before me is that instead of a system, we have a great amount of legalities, of multiple legalities, with their own right, and the intercourses between these legalities, regulative, juris generator entities, is how to arbitrate in terms of fairness and justice between them. Not to build up for the system. It's a different perspective. Sorry.
Matthias, you want to say something? Or?
And I understand, actually I have sympathy with Manuel's criticism that at least among those who do legal theory, jurisprudence, they are preoccupied with the classical defining features of law, if say you're a Hartian or Keltenian. And then you worry about sources and system, and then you find that problematic, and fragmentation will then be a problem, and you struggle with that. As if these, on this abstract level, these formal features were the most important issues to focus on. I think Neil and you also, when you said, well, really at the end of this it's a question of what we see at the moment are exercises of reimagining the world of law and how it all fits together. There are competing paradigms, so there's real conflict. So this is a great time for lawyers. So it's not just that there are battles politically fought out between different actors. There are also battles between different people who attribute different meaning to these things through the lens of the law. And those who will triumph will then define what counts as a coherent legal system in the future. And their descriptions of the world will then guide and structure debates in the future. So, and when we think about these the competition between different paradigms and different ways of imagining the world, then what we have to do and what we need to do to adjudicate between them is to think about what materially, what substantively this really is about. And this is why I think the language, on the one hand, the potentially critical, it's also a legitimatory, rationalizing language, but also the critical language of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, as a way of taming and constraining and guiding how markets should be designed so they actually fulfill good purposes, is central for thinking about the world of law. So this, if you ask materially, what is it that we're talking about, then at least within the dominant paradigm. If you look at this from within the dominant paradigm of the, call it the Washington Consensus, the Fukuyama triumphalists, so even if we sympathetically reconstruct this from the inside, then the challenge will be to come up with a conception of global law which is open to and critical which is open to markets while critical of the possibility of capital to run roughshod over the basic values of human rights, democracy, and rule of law. So just as there is a tension potentially between human rights and democracy, they are ideally, on some ideal level, they complement each other. But in practice, we can see that sometimes we have to negotiate what appear to be tensions between the two. And the same is true for capitalism, so market power of certain entities, and other values we care about. And so what we need to do, but that's something that needs to be done, I think, in a very concrete and specific, institutionally focused way. We must see whether there are practices and whether there are problems which are better addressed within one way of thinking about global law rather than another. So in other words, we have to be critical of certain ways of conceptualizing law that tend to rationalize and legitimate certain forms of dominant power. And we have to find a frame, and we have to find a concept of law which allows us to adequately criticize forms of domination when they appear. That's the challenge. So that's one of the criteria, I think. If there's a competition between different paradigms and different ways of reconstructing the world of law, if we ask, well, which one is the more attractive one? Which one should we choose? Then beyond the idea that they have to actually fit, and they have to make sense of the world as it actually exists, the other criterion is that they have to make moral sense in the way that I just described.
I think one of the problems there, and certainly, and here I would be very critical of my own group, because I try to deal with so many problems. The problem too far was actually trying to work out the relationship between global law and actually a broad conception of global justice. And what Matthias has just given us is one, at least partial conception of what global justice might look like. But think about this, right? Before we even have, leaving aside all the question of who gets to decide and what voices are heard in what context, etc., etc., think about how complicated the question is, how contentious the question of global justice is, right? So there's a number of different ways in which, we actually disagree. We don't even begin to have a joint conception of it. One is, some people understand global justice as a singular thing, right? There's only one planet, and justice is something which should be organized across that planet, okay? Other people, John Rawls springs to mind, think of it in plural terms, that actually the globe is not one justice community, it's a whole bunch of justice communities, let's call them peoples or states, and there's a kind of residual, externality is global justice community which goes beyond that, right? But that Rawls view is not something that's one that would be agreed with by, say, Peter Singer or Thomas Polgar or whatever. So you already have that massive divide. What are we even talking about when we're talking about global justice? Are we talking about a single unit, or are we talking about a bunch of different units? A second distinction we have is between what I would call a holistic and a composite notion of global justice. Does economic justice, environmental justice, and all these different things, do they all hang together organically? Or can we segmentalize them and say that we can have environmental justice, political justice, economic justice, etc., etc.? Again, even before you answer the question, you have to answer the meta question, or whether you can think of it as a whole, or you think of it in terms of segments. And then there's another set of questions which has to do with scale, scope, and intensity. Is global justice a set of general parameters which is then filled out in specific areas? Are we interested in notions such as due process, margin of appreciation, ideas of proportionality, subsidiarity, etc., and then we leave it to the world to develop these in different contexts? Or is global justice something which penetrates very deeply into particular communities? So the problem is that on the one hand, we have this massive question of where we even get a handle and a traction on global law. On the other hand, even if you imagine a thought experiment that we were to resolve that in an adequate way, We then have to move on to all the debates and all the contestations that we have amongst ourselves, or sometimes don't have, we certainly pass over them, about what global justice means. Because you can't have a concept of global law which is unconnected to a concept of global justice. I mean, Matthias is not a culprit here. He's one of the few people who actually tries to link the two of them together. But not very many people do, partly because it is massively difficult. It raises all sorts of questions, not just practical questions and prudential questions about how you get things moving, but massively difficult questions of political philosophy. And again, about how we imagine the world, not here necessarily in terms of global law, but in terms of justice, of what the world looks like as a justice community.
If I may step in here, we're already touching something, the grand question of global justice that we might speak about also after the break, but it's great. But I just wanted to go back a few steps and to maybe put some order what has been just said in the last hour or so. So I really liked your anecdote about that conference at NYU on the global administrative law, because it really pinpoints to the essence of it all. I mean, what we are talking about today, transnational and global, this is not something that's somewhere in the air, somewhere in the clouds, but it's something that really exists. It is there. And as you say in your book, it's actually inevitable. Yeah. So the people at NYU didn't invent global administrative law, but they only provided a conceptual framework. They invented the glasses through which we were able to see that there is indeed something beyond the state, that there is something like global administrative law. So this means that when we are talking about transnational and global law, we are in this constant oscillation between practice that is already there and the train is already gone and we are jumping on it, and our theories through which we want to understand what's actually going on. And by doing so, at the same time we are socially constructing this very practice through the theories that we are developing. And here is, of course, very important, the cognitive frame that we started with. What are our normative biases with which we enter this theoretical framing of what's going on? That's one difficult question. But the other one, which is on a lower level of abstraction and with which we might finish this first part of the session, is the following. Matthias has said, well, it's obvious for lawyers that there are many sources out there beyond the state. There's EU law, etc., etc. But I would say, is this really right? Is this really the case? In many countries, people, and not just people, the citizens, but actually lawyers, practicing lawyers, they still think that they are working with a cocon, with a sort of a self-sustained and closed solipsistic state where the only status law is the law of the land, and there's nothing else. So there is indeed a challenge of getting to know about transnational law. And I think here it is the legal education that has an important role to play. Would you agree?
Yeah, but I mean, one thing you might say there, and I don't think anyone would disagree, it's not that what I call the box matrix system has disappeared. It just has competitors, right? And there is a way of talking about much of transnational law, not all of it, but there is a way of talking about it which reduces it to state law. There still is, you still have, you go into any international law faculty in any country in the world, and you'll meet people who will use all their intellectual ingenuity to try to explain to you that actually this is a matter of sources. It's a matter of certain conventional international law sources, and all these other legal epiphenomena can somehow be reduced back to these sources. And I think it's always a Pyrrhic victory when people do that. Because what it's, you say, yeah, okay, fine, you've managed to reduce the world to these terms. Well done. But you've actually provided a framework of understanding which obscures as much as it illuminates by doing that. And actually you need other understandings as well to make better sense of these developments.
But the problem might be even worse, because you might have the majority of people who wouldn't even care. They would even argue that nothing has changed, and they don't even care what's going on beyond the state. It's not that they would like to distill this back on the state's sources, but they simply, their horizon is so limited that they think that all that there is their state. So that legal education, I think, has an important role to play to break up this limited perspective.
let me take up Neil's example of the Global Administrative Law Project, because there was the normative idea behind it was the following. It was, we noticed there is all this stuff going on. There are all these institutional actors, the World Bank, the IMF, all kinds of actors, making decisions in a kind of, these are not high level, these are not things you read about in the paper mostly. These are kind of intermediary decisions that as an international lawyer you will not study. But they're important, they affect people's lives, they have real consequences. And their money is being distributed, considerable amounts. Policy is being influenced domestically. And nobody's studying this. Because it's this netherworld. Why is nobody studying this? Because people are stuck in the cognitive frame of only studying national law. It matters often for what national politics can do in many countries, what happens in these institutions. But because people, lawyers, are educated within the statist framework, they don't see it. And because they don't see it, they can't adequately, intelligently deal with it. They can't criticize it, they can't engage it constructively, they can't strategize how to make things work for the country that's affected by it. By having a cognitive frame that denies a blinder, that denies the reality of these institutional practices, that doesn't focus on them, that pretends that they don't exist, that has serious disadvantages and consequences for affected countries. So their idea was, we have to study this. We have to kind of publicize this. We're going to build across continents a group of people studying these things. And then secondly, the second thing that happens is when you see what happens is that sometimes some of these procedures are actually quite problematic. So if you take ordinary standards that we know from standard domestic administrative law, and again, these are standards we draw from liberal constitutional democracies, participation, accountability, transparency, justification, reason giving, these kinds of things. When we apply those standards that are commonplace in administrative proceedings to international institutions, well, some of them don't do that well. Some of them do, but some of them don't. And then they deserve to be criticized as such. And reforms ought to be initiated and pushed. But that will only happen if there are actors who are aware of these practices and who have thought about the normative significance of those practices, and then insist that these are the appropriate standards that these institutions too should meet. So there is, so in this way, there is a normative agenda which is connected to global administrative law. And now, so this is the global administrative law example. Let me give you one other point. So when we think about how you were taught constitutional law, whether you teach it yourself maybe, or how it was taught. The standard way of teaching constitutional law, and this is close to universal, this is irrespective of whether you're in the United States, in Germany, or I bet, Slovenia. There are going to be textbooks which are going to be Slovenian constitutional law. And then they will start with, maybe a brief, couple of pages history. There was this happened, and then in 1991, and then you have the text. And then you talk about democracy. So there's rights, there's democratic process, separation of powers, and then you have all the chapters, and then the description of the relevant legal rules. As if this was a Slovenian thing. It is Slovenian law. It's the Slovenian constitution. But it has so much to do in normative terms. It's a result of a historical process in which a lot of contestation, a lot of battles, ideological battles were fought in lots of different places in the world to achieve certain prominence of certain institutional solutions, certain basic ideas. And it is crazy to study constitutional law only in a national context. These books ought to be rewritten. And what they should do is, they should provide an account of constitutionalism across jurisdictions in a comparative, historical, theoretical, rich way, which will use national constitutions as examples and also make you think about the specificity of what we've decided on in our jurisdiction and how it's different from others, and then we might think about the reasons we have for doing it that way rather than another way. And this is what education is about, by providing a deeper understanding of the rules that we have and why we have them, and how they relate to other possibilities and other arguments about why we might have, why we might prefer or not other possibilities. So in other words, constitutional law, as a heart of a classical domestic discipline, is a discipline which ought to be, I think, taught a little bit like global administrative law, in the sense that you draw on lots of different institutional practices, and then you use the national practice really as an example, an illustration for how these things can work out. By the way, there is one, if you ask, well, what's the model for a textbook? I haven't written one, so I'm not selling my book here. But what's the model of a textbook for this type of enterprise? Then please don't lynch me because of this, but methodologically, not substantively, methodologically, the most interesting book that was written is a 1928 work by Carl Schmitt, Verfassungslehre, Constitutional Theory. He understands, he wrote the constitutional theory, Verfassungslehre, of the liberal constitutional state. Now he misunderstands it, he has a bad theory of it. But
It's the best book.
but he understands, so this is a book that exemplifies what it could mean to combine, to see constitutions as the result of ideological struggles and conflict that lead to the dominance of certain types of institutional arrangements, but that still are different versions of it that are connected to interesting differences across jurisdictions and different kinds of arguments that then win out. So this is history, theory, and doctrine together in kind of a wider, not just national, but in a wider comparative global context. So this is how, on the one hand, the story, global administrative law, how legal education has actually already made and can make a difference. And the second, as an example that just illustrates how peculiar the old cognitive biases of a statist focus, which prevents us to see how things are, or how they might be seen more appropriately, is still quite dominant. It's still quite strong. And we shouldn't take that as natural or as obvious and as given. We should seriously ask, why do we teach this stuff the way that we do? Shouldn't we be teaching it quite differently?
There's a degree course in Tilburg in Holland, which is, I would say, the first time since the Middle Ages, when it was the norm, that the way in which their undergraduates do law is they start off by doing an undergraduate degree in global law, right? And then at the postgraduate level, they do domestic law. You just think about that. Just think about what that might look like, you know. And I'm not close enough to the syllabus to see how it works, but apart from anything else, it seems to me fascinating intellectually, because it's based upon an idea that you can actually make coherent sense of the notion of law, you know, without reference initially and foundationally to any particular system. So you understand it in general before you understand it in particular. And that is so much against the intuitions of most people teaching the law, that it made it actually quite an audacious thing. Now, of course, in the Middle Ages, you know, people were, you know, when there was no written down local law, people understood law by reference to Roman law, etc., etc. That was the model for understanding law, but that was in a pre-state system. It's a much more audacious thing to try to do within the interstices of the state-based system.
So, if I may use one daring analogy. So imagine you were an engineer, and you wanted to learn about engineering, laws governing construction of dams, bridges, etc. And imagine you went to a national faculty, and that national faculty taught you exclusively and in great detail how the local dam was constructed, and how the bridges that connect that go over the major river of the country, how that works. Now, you can do that because the general laws governing engineering also apply to the local dams and the local bridges. But it would be weird genuinely weird to construct a curriculum around insisting that you study the exact nature of these bridges and these dams, rather than seeing these bridges and dams as instantiations applied to a very particular context. And the context matters. It matters what the particular ground is like, what the particular landscape is like. So this isn't about universal laws that are just simply applied. It's about contextualizing them and making them fit in within the local culture and history. But it is still something universal that you make fit. So nobody has the idea that engineering should be designed along national lines. And the claim is, or at least we should think about, whether there is not, at least to some extent, I don't want to push this too far, but at least to some extent there isn't an analogy here for the law as well. So that even though ultimately we make decisions locally and often on the state level still about many decisions, we do so informed by ideas and legal requirements, which are of a more universal sort that we need to incorporate and integrate into the national solutions.
Before we go for a break, Gianluigi and Jose Manuel. Gianluigi, you already sort of were critical, right? You were... No, really, but in the undertone, initially you were critical, so you were saying, oh, if you want me to develop this in a non-neutral way, and you were intimating that there is something that actually there might be strong normative biases in there. And Jose Manuel, you've been critical. I mean, your work has been about the critique of this cognitive frame, of the Eurocentric Western cognitive frame through which we are now approaching developing the theories to frame what's going on now in the arena. Before we go for a break, what would you say? What we just heard. Also in the sense of the importance of legal education, because those who are teaching, they come with certain epistemic perspectives inbuilt maybe normative biases.
Well, I had some good answer about legal. Doesn't matter.
You always say that.
Exactly. Making me feel guilty constantly.
Yeah, you should. So the question this time is about the cultural bias. Okay. Yeah, it is. First, okay, let me be brief. First, it is unavoidable.
There is cultural, but it's...
There is. It's very important to recognize this. Because the accused normally charges that we deny that there is a cultural bias. There is. But there is cultural bias, even in the critique of this cultural bias. And this must be recognized. I don't think that there are neutral or godlike positions in this discussion. The second point is that think of international law. International law was an expression coined by Jeremy Bentham in about 1789, and together with civilized nations, another couple of terms coined for the occasion. So international law was born out of Western bias. No, not Western bias. European, not even European. France and England. Then the point was how to go beyond France and England for international law civilization to Europeans, and then beyond the Scubrium Europae towards the rest of the world, as dignified to be part of this kind of intercourses of realm of international law states. Now, so there are some attitudes that we can take, because we use human rights, democracy, equality, morality, dignity, rule of law, every time. These are biased notions, everyone would say, are Western notions. So what is our attitude towards these? These are called universals. Also, Professor Kuhn was stressing this point. So, the attitude towards universal is the precise point that connects to cultural bias. First, I would side with Michael Walzer. Of course, from an external perspective, a global perspective that is not suited to us, we see these universals very thin, and sometimes even meaningless. So meaningless and abstract that they can be used only as an ideological tool in order to conceal inequality, exploitation, and so forth. From a located, situated point of view, normally these universals are voiced with a maximum of thickness, of meaningfulness, because they have some diverse content that is different even along the series of those very restricted number of those civilized nations. Now, is there anything that makes important to have the thin side of these universals? This is the question. Personally, my attitude is the following. That I learned it from the Frankfurt School and my studies in the 80s, and their theories, their critical theories about these ideological tools. Of course, they are what they are. They conceive what they should not. Okay. But at a certain point, they say, even these ideas like beauty in the great artwork, or some other ideas like human rights and democracy, if they are painted and voiced beyond being an instrumentalizable tool, they say something that can be universally recognized in a way that, what was it called? Promesse de bonheur, the promise of happiness. This is a kind of clue towards something that disempowers the power of ideology, in the sense that gives some vision of the possibilities, of the potential that are, as things stand, still unavailable. And you might remember, injustice is something that is clearly perceivable. There was, you remember the preface of Amartya Sen book about the idea of justice, in which Amartya Sen quoted Charles Dickens' Great Expectations and recalled the sentence of Pip, that he said, there is, more or less, there is nothing so finely perceived by all as injustice. It's not a problem of justice, it's a problem of injustice. The capacity to arrive, to touch injustice is what is enhanced by the cultivations of the thinness of these universals. So if we get rid of them, of course we get rid of their ideological power, but at the same time we get rid of them as instruments of empowerment.
Jose Manuel, maybe a few sentences before we go forward?
Yes. Something very short about legal education. And I would like to bring the case of the Colombian legal education consider. I think the curriculum in Colombia may coincide with that description that you, both Matthias and Neil, have described as nationally orientated pensum in all the areas of law. But in constitutional law, we have something different. We have an LLB that lasts 5 years, and we have subjects 1 year each. And in the first year, we have general constitutional law, and in the second year we have Colombian constitutional law. So in the first year we have the French constitutional system, the English constitutional system, the US constitutional system, a bit of the fundamental law of Germany, a bit of the Spanish constitution, because in part due to our Eurocentrism, we look for the models in Europe, but also because effectively in history we created our constitutional system on the basis of that. So we use the Declaration of the Right of Man to justify the struggle for independence against the Spanish Empire. So in some way we use a very modern Eurocentric Western tradition to fight against another Western tradition of imperialism. And then when we adopted the first constitution during the 19th century, we have 10 or more constitutions. In every single one we had a Bill of Rights modeled on the French Bill of Rights and also the US Constitution. And within this subject of general constitutional law, we also deal with theory, general theory, like Schmitt, Karl Lowenstein, Maurice Oliu, the French and the Germans, mainly. And so, in some way, being Eurocentric is not necessarily a bad thing. It has a number of negative things, but also the positive thing of having a worldwide view about what is going on in other places of the world. We know, even sometimes we know more about the French history and the English history, more about that than about Latin American history or even Colombian history, which is a negative side of the problem.
Okay, on this note, I think it's high time we make a break. We made a break, we go for coffee, and we'll be back in 15 minutes.